First, there was nothing. The entire universe was empty and devoid of any bright and fun, crazy colors and color combinations. And then, God said, well, Kami, or the Kitsune Kami God said, let there be light and let there be Kiryu. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to VKH Live. I am your host, Jeff DeWitt. We are here for a special Kiryu stream, or a special stream about Kiryu, either or. I have Kiryu playing in the background. I have Kiryu playing in the background personally. I'm listening to them. I'm listening to the new album as we speak. I've got it on pause for now, but I may turn it back on since I'm monologuing for most of tonight. But I have them playing in the slider, in this little slider here above me. Kiryu has a really nice long storied history of looks. I've got it on a loop, so it'll start over. But it's nice. It's a nice. I just realized it's literally 26 different looks I found over the course of their career, and so I was like, yeah, sure, why not? Here's a nice, crazy. Colorful display. So let's see here. I want to pull up some stats for them for later, but yeah, we're gonna go ahead and jump right into it with this band. Just kind of talk about like their whole deal. Okay, so if you haven't listened to Kiryu or aren't incredibly sure, like, you know, about them, you may or may not have some preconceived notions. You either have you really have one of two wildly different preconceived notions. You either have a preconceived notion that they're kind of like they're kind of like Kagra in that, and they picked up where they left off, and so they make light, pretty music, and you know it's kind of like discount Kagra. Or you have the preconceived notion that they are a bunch of that they're like a super heavy psychopath band, and and make all kinds of crazy music and gory videos. And it entirely depends on which music video you stumbled on YouTube, I suppose. But I guess you're kind of right in either case. Kiryu back in their early days, their indie days, they started out, you could tell, very inspired by Kagra, I would say. You know, definitely in... there's only so many Angre K bands that are ever really around at one point. You know, like I don't know why. I think that having a band where you're like full of these like you know, where you're inspired by the traditional garb and stuff, I think is pretty great. But you know, they would make some soft songs and some funky songs and things like that. But what Kagra was always most known for was like there's usually more of their softer side. Their like that was what people like loved them for, and mixing in the traditional music to really make a just a really pleasant, really amazing kind of a sound. Although they would do this kind of these other layers of, or these other styles of sounds as well. so Kiryu kind of started in there, but it was always kind of, I think, maybe a little bit more rapid tempo. Uh, and I that's about all I remember from their early stuff. So I came into Kiryu a few years in, but when I found Kiryu, they were just a few steps into broadening their range to be anything across the spectrum from like that lighter stuff all the way to like this crazy spooky horror rock, and that's really what they started to make their name on as they were growing. So like the more like people found out from them, as more and more people started finding out from them, I guess in a more mainstream sense, like from more mainstream sources, and as opposed to like, when they were really indie, they started having a reputation as less as this horror rock Angare band. And let me check something real quick on here. Just had a thought. Okay, cool. So yeah, that is kind of where they really kind of established that, like, yeah, this is a thing that definitely separates you from Kagra and from the average band. But then as they kept growing, they would flip from this they've got this bipolar spectrum here, and they would flip from one side to the other between singles, from song to song. But they just got really impressive in terms of how they were combining, the more traditional music with either kind of like brooding hard rock or metal riffs and instrumentation, or this more elegant and really melodic guitar work. But then the moods started to blend together. So you would have like a soothing, like a kind of happy, soothing-ish song, but then like there might be like these dark undertones, like I guess like like a poorly played piano keys, like off-key piano keys playing in the background, or they might switch back and forth between the moods. And so that's been like the latest thing lately, is that more and more like they've just been adding more layers and experimenting with more like just trying to put you on as wild of an emotional and musical mind melt or mind fuck as they possibly can. So the end result of this, though, is that they have this massive discography covering with songs that are touching on every mode and emotion, and I guess vibe, or and using so many different musical styles, so many so many different styles of rock, so many different combinations of traditional instruments, non-traditional instruments. They actually, like, after fairly recently started, you would hear every now and then like what sound like DJ scratches or like some static noise. Piano will pop up every now and then outside of all of the more traditional Japanese instruments. And it's just they really have gotten to the point where there is something for everyone. There is a song for everyone, and they've been really insistent on just continuing to experiment and change things up. And yeah, so like I don't want to go too far back. I don't want to make this like a whole biography and everything like that. But I was hoping to just kind of frame it in context of like just how much they've really done, uh, you know, in terms of their growth and their experimentation, especially on their more recent albums, because it's genuinely, some of the stuff is genuinely stunning to me that they've been able to, pull off certain kinds of combinations of sounds, or songs written in these certain ways. Like some of this stuff should just, it's the most bizarre concepts on paper, and like they don't, like, I'm like listening to it like I can't believe they pulled this off. So at the same time, however, while they're doing all this, crazy experimentation that they just keep nailing, and I'll get into like what that actually is when I like talk about the their albums a little bit, because their last few albums are like a really big deal. Like I don't know, like from this most recent album and the album before it, I don't know any music like it outside of this. Like I haven't heard music that sounds quite like what I heard on this most recent album, and especially the album prior. But yeah, so I before covering some of that, I just kind of wanted to lay out some of like the overall, like just the overall kind of status of where Kiryu's at. Oh, sorry. I remembered. I almost just lost my train of thought. But yeah, so that's kind of been a description of their growth and the wildness that's come with it. On the flip side, in more recent years, they've just gotten really good at writing nice, pretty songs that like a lot of people can listen to. I think the breakout song for them really was Etsu to Utsu, in terms of them, crashing into the mainstream, into mainstream popularity. Like I remember that ended up charting in the main Oricon top 10. And then what was really surprising is that following Etsu to Utsu, there were other singles that charted in the Oricon top 10 that were not like Etsu to Utsu. Etsu to Utsu is a very heavenly, very gorgeous song. It uses a lot of classical, or a lot of traditional Japanese instrumentation. It's just really relaxing. It's a really nice song. You can check out the PV on YouTube, on BP Records YouTube channel. It's got like, people like that song. I like that song. It's got like 1.5 million views on it and everything like that. But Kiryu has gotten other releases, and I'm trying to find to grab their Oricon page actually, because I just had the thought, it would probably be a good idea to give that a shot, or to get see if you can find it, because that would be an interesting thing to know about the more recent releases. But they got so they were able to get to crack the top 10 with that, but then like follow up singles that cracked the top 10 weren't necessarily like that like light. Some of them were actually very very heavy or creepy, like doing the creepy horror thing. And so then they just kept continuing to kind of improve and just like having the best of both worlds in terms of like just experimenting every which way possible and still being like incredibly successful at the same time. So the end result has been a lot of really creative content from them. And I feel like there's a lot of people that have been missing out because they've kind of overlooked Kiryu, because like they kind of seem like the top dog on the indie food chain, or certainly the BP Records food chain, like to the point where it's like, oh, they're not really like gonna be that interesting as an indie band, but they genuinely are interesting. The music they're making is genuinely fascinating. They're kind of just leading like this crazy experiment of how many different ways can we like evolve and mutate our music to just melt your mind with simultaneously beautiful and horrifying looks and sounds. So that's about where where they're at the moment. But let me see give me 5 seconds. Let me see if I can grab this. Grab the deets on these guys, because I think it would be. Yeah, I figured it might not exist. The page itself might not exist. Oh wait, I think I found it. Okay, cool. Yeah, it's not really around. Sorry, thought it was around. But yeah, so that's like a general intro to Kiryu, I would say. I'm gonna run through a few of their more recent albums, and then I'm gonna talk about their most recent one, which I have been listening to. And I'm intent on commenting on. So let me pull up a little discography list real quick. Just for my personal notes. Because God knows I don't. Because God knows I need to make sure I read these very carefully. Because they're all Japanese names. So here comes the pronunciation hell. I would say there's kind of a clear point where Kiryu started to take off and like find themselves, really, really define themselves. But I will say one of the amazing things about Kiryu is how many of their like B-sides or non-PV tracks, like tracks like those become like are fantastic. To the point where like you can even tell on their live DVDs, it's like if you just happen to decide like, All right, they just put out a single. I'll listen to a B side, or I'll listen to the B sides. You know, like how great, you know, how bad could it be? Like I'll just see. You know, um, there's a really high chance you'll find a B side on there that you're just like absolutely obsessed with, because they will try like these crazy concepts, or they'll you know, they'll do all of these different like experiments in their B-sides sometimes, that it's just like that will just kind of blow your mind. And then you know, especially some of the ones that blow your mind and are also hyper catchy at the same time. It's very common for them to become like massive fan favorites. It seems. Because like when I was looking at like a live digest that they had, and they were replaying some of these songs that I happen to know because they were my personal favorites. So I'm assuming they were fan favorites, but these songs were like years and years and years old, and they were just B sides, and like these other or like these non PV tracks. They're otherwise very randomly in the set list, but it's just because like even the most random Kiryu track, or just like off the cusp Kiryu track in recent years, has been like, you know, really really good sometimes. And I'm not saying like every song by them is amazing. Like I think if you go back, you know, there's people have their favorites and their non-favorites and stuff, but and if you go back early enough, you can there's a definite point where things started to come together, you know, versus prior, which leads me into what I've been about to say, which is I would say they found a few hits with the Mugen Hoyo album in 2011, which had Mugen Hoyo, which is I think the earliest released Kiryu song that I think I really was into, and it's a little spooky, but like more just kind of like hard rock and kind of it wasn't horror rock. It was just like a little bit spooky there in the temple. There's fire everywhere for the PV, and it's just but it's just really catchy, like the instrumentation they're doing, and they're really and they're showing off like their instrumentation skills. You know, they're all quite talented. Both guitarists can shred like a motherfucker, and yeah, so I think they were starting to find their footing there, but it was you know, the singles leading up to, and then definitely the actual album Shuka Ensign, that I think really was what kicked off them finding their identity, at least, and starting to accelerate with their growth. Shuga Ensign was basically their metal album to a degree. It was I think up until this point, like people like me had just kind of been listening for like the PV tracks and the singles, and maybe a few of their older songs. I don't know. They have a lot of older singles that I don't even bother with necessarily, but Shuka Ensign was like this really dark, creepy. It was a like horror experience, and the full album was there's a lot going on in it. The Shuka Ensign PV also like stood out big time because it was extremely gory, but more in like a story, like a narrative. But it was more of it was in more of a narrative setting than your average gory VK PV, which is just like blood's flying everywhere, everything's gross. This one was like creepy because it was like this girl finding like this, I don't know, this crazy demonic looking uh, guy in all set in 16th century Japan, and like, or I don't know if it was a like this creepy guy or girl, but it's like he had this massive growth covering his face, and then it was revealed that he was a cannibal, and it was like gory, and like it was just creepy. It was really really creepy. um, and yeah, so that's what I think turned people a lot of started turning a lot of people more in the indie phase onto them. And the other side of that is that that album had the song Kyose, which is a very light song, and it's a very good song too. There's like these cascading guitar melodies. It's very pleasant to listen to. But it stands out in stark contrast with some of the horror based PVs on it, which were there uh, it which there were. So they were already like just naturally like, well, we like both, that is kind of how they've been for a while. So they've gotten pretty good at it. It's just, if I remember correctly, chronologically, the horror thing, sped up and developed much faster than the lighter rock Kagra inspired sound ever had to be. So after that album, I'm not gonna go through the singles because I think they all ended up on the next album. But they released whoops, lost my place. Where am I? Kyoka Suigetsu. This album is where they had kind of started to achieve mainstream success in spite of being an indie band, and this album kind of expanded out to more genres that or more sounds that I guess were lighter and therefore more mainstream friendly technically, but I think in practice it didn't really turn out that way. What I'm getting at is that it's not a borderline metal album like Shuka Ensign was. Like Shuka Ensign was hard rock, and some heavy metal. I would say I just put it as horror rock. That's what staff at VKH had been calling it for years. But it wasn't as metal intensive, like chugging riffs and stuff. And it was more, but it was more, and it did have some light tracks on there, but there was still definitely some horror songs. The album's PV, I think the single right before the album was Akaimi Hajiketa, and it feels like horror music. Like it's puts you in a panic, in a good way. It's like it's really epic and badass. But a lot of the tracks on the album kind of come off spooky, but spooky and dark, but like light at the same time. I would say, like there's and above all, though, a lot of those tracks were really catchy and engaging. So it was actually because of that. It was actually like the non-PV tracks that really made this album for me. I think this is arguably my favorite album, actually. Just because there were so many tracks on it that kept me so engaged, and it's kind of fun that it's hard to place the music on there as like, is it heavy, is it light, like Etsuto Utsu is quite clearly light, and then Akaimi Hachiketa is quite clearly heavy. But then in between those two tracks on the album is Seiten no Hekireki, which has got all kinds of like they're growling and in it, but then they're also like singing in like a in like a almost like a like there are sorcerer chanting a chant, but it's with la la la's. I don't know how to describe it, I guess. And it's like it's creepy and it's kind of funny because they're like la 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 la, and you know you can and it definitely sounds spooky, but it's not like heavy dark horror rock, you know. And so it kind of like added new layers of depth. It wasn't just, oh, we're heavy 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 and then we go up to brooding maybe a little bit and now we're up to like a you know, a lighter song, like, you know, just like that, just like, you know, dark dark dark, a little bit less dark, and then here's, you know, here's a high pitched one. That was kind of like what Shuka Ensign was. This was like adding a few layers in between for the first time, and that was good. When I say this, sorry, I meant Kyoka Suigetsu. After that, a few years passed. They put out quite a few album or singles, and so on these singles, what something very curious I started to happen during this time. The B-sides, you'll recall the B-sides I mentioned, where they'll just do these songs that are so like they're crazy wild mad scientist experiments. They always seemed to pull them off, but you know, they were the kind of song you would never expect to be an A-side, like the promo track, just because they're so wild. They're so wild, but and they sound and even though they sound so good, you know, it's not really gonna happen. Well, that changed with the singles that ended up being on their album in 2016, which was called Hyaki Yako. So the singles following Kyoka's Suigetsu, in other words, these singles started using those absolutely insane and ambitious and wild sounds and song structures and everything like that for the A-sides. So Kiryu achieved even more popularity with you know, playing with more catchy songs and like and a wider variety of song, I don't know what you would call it, a wider variety of song styles on Kyoka Suigetsu that kind of ranged from kind of the horror rock thing up through kind of like the light popular song thing. You know, they got pretty big through that album, and then they just leaned into the batshit craziness. So by the time where are we at? Hyaki Yako comes around. The Kiryu sound is like at a point that I'm just like I was completely blown away because it was just so wildly experimental and savage, and like it was overclocked is almost like the way I would put it. It was like they did not give a flying fuck on that album. They tried to make songs as big and full of experimentation and instrumentation and like all different kinds of combinations of styles and sounds. I had just never heard anything quite like it in multiple cases. This is the album that QB was on. That's the one where with the PV where they're the vocalist is committing seppuku and there's blood everywhere and everything. That was one of the more normal sounding songs. There are some just really bold, utterly trippy experimentations on that album. I'm not sure if I find some of these songs like some of these songs, like they have a song called Chizuru and a song called Aun and a song called Hizuri Kuni. Basically, like the first third of the album, in and around QB. So like tracks like those got absolutely hooked in my head, and they are wild and experimental, and it worked really well. But there's other songs on the album, like the title track and the PV track, Hiaki Yako, which are like fine, but they're just kind of all over the place and just don't quite do it for me personally. So I guess it would depend on the. I guess what songs you would like kind of depends on what kinds of sounds you tolerate, and whether or not Kiryu did them in that combination in a song on the album. Because it's so, they're doing so many things. It's hard. It's really hard for me to describe. I guess the easiest way is, it's like, I don't think I ever would have expected, traditional Japanese instruments to be used in such like brutally heavy ways in some cases, or utterly crazy ways. I guess that's one example I can give of, like, the crazy stuff they're doing that's like throwing you for a double take, or throwing you for a loop. The guitars in some of these, in some of these songs, they're like, Kiryu's always had like some cool guitar distortions and stuff, and they take it to another level, man. So for Hiaki Yako, I was quite shell shocked. Just in case you didn't notice, I thought it was great. I was like, this is intense. And then the last few years have been leading up to Tensho Rene, which actually came out last month as their most recent album. So the singles, so they put out singles, and they did they put out a mini album, or was it just a double A side? Looks like a double A side. So they've put out a bunch of singles. They're all on the album. The order in which the singles came out, if you were watching the PVs and things like that, was a little kind of concerning, because I think you started with Gekabijin, which is like really bright, and like the PV is just like an explosion of pink and white and like all kinds of colors like that. But and the song itself is like kind of got that overclocked Angurke feel to it from the previous album, but it's all melodic and upbeat at the same time. So it's just like a really frantically pleasant song. And then it's got like some crazy traditional Japanese instrumentation going on the entire time as well. I'll have to go in and like really research like the different types of Japanese instruments. I mean, one in general, and then two that they use, and then three, like which one is used, because it's not my forte, but it's in terms of I just don't have that knowledge at the moment. But I'm very curious about like what made them use certain instruments when. So that was fine, right? That was like them just doing the like crazy experimental thing from Hiaki Yako, but in another experimental way, right? And then the single after that was Watashi wa Kairai Saru Gutsuwa no Ningyo, and that was that was another heavy, creepy track, and it. I mean, the PV for it was pretty savage. It's just. I'll just say they pressed R for rope a lot in that PV because they're all tied up and someone may or may not be hanging themselves. And let's see. Yeah, so and that song was good as well. But I was noticing it sounded kind of familiar to some past sounds. And then Jo no Ka and Oboro Zukio came out. Those were two. That was a double A side. The PVs for that were not. That was where I started to get a little worried because it just wasn't. It didn't seem like anything too new anymore. One was definitely a horror, and one was definitely like an upbeat song, and maybe that's what they were trying to go back to, but it made me a little nervous. That's for sure. In that I just, after having so much interest in Kiryu releases, like I was on the one hand, they're not bad songs. Like it's like nobody else is making music like this anyway, and so it's not like they were bad songs. It's just I was like, uh-oh, have they run out of ideas? And then they put out Hashigure as a single, and this was another one where I was like, well, it was the opposite problem, which was, well, I don't think it sounds like anything else, but it sounds like their experimental thing's not quite working out too well, if I remember correctly, or I just didn't think it was like my thing. One or the other. And then they put out Muku. And Muku is as a single, I guess, right before the... No, I'm sorry. I was talking about... Wait, which one's Hashigure? I may have these mixed up. My bad. I may have the incorrect... let me check. Oh, I see. What is this one? Okay, Hashigure is something entirely different, I guess. I don't know. Maybe I didn't... Maybe I didn't actually like dislike any of these when I heard them. I just remember coming off of my main thing was just like coming off of Hyaki Yako, their last album. I was just so ready for more craziness that I remember watching these and then just never watching them again was the main thing. So I was kind of nervous going into Tensho Rine because I was worried I was going to get an album where it just kind of felt like they completely had run out of ideas or like they weren't doing so hot. And I've said this on other shows as well. But let's get into Tensho Rine because I've been able to listen through it a couple times. And I actually think Tensho Rine is really, really good. And I'm not worried anymore. So as an album, I think Tensho Rine has the best flow of any album. In terms of originality, it's not wildly original. Like, it doesn't always have to be wildly original because nobody's making this sound. really. And Hiaki Yako was like had the originality and ambition, like just objectively, like I've never heard that before. How the fuck did you like? What is that? Like it's got that in spades for sure. So this one doesn't like come back to that. It was almost like these singles when they were putting them out, starting with Geka with you know Geka Bijin and slowly transitioning back to like uh, you know this less overclocked sound. I don't know how else to describe that album, to be honest. um, it's almost like they were doing all of that so that they could recap on everything they've added to their sounds the last few years and go and mature it. So this was like the album of maturing, basically. Like they took all these crazy experimentations and stuff, and everything in this album is something I can almost certainly point to a sound or something that was first developed on another album. It's not that songs sound the same. I think that happens a couple times, but not really that often. It's more like just there were very distinct sounds that were developed on say Shuka Ensen, like really creepy deep guitar riffs in the back, like deep guitar riffs in the background, and then really creepy like distorted guitar playing in the foreground, putting like a really spooky, heavy, creepy mode. Like that was really big on Shuka Ensen, and then like Kyoka Sugetsu afterwards didn't really reuse that a ton, but like then it focused on like a more ominous, spooky, atmospheric feel created using like the backing instruments in combination with like some I guess like less pronounced catchy guitar riffs and stuff like that. And then like Hiaki Yako would have ditched both of those things, would have maybe switched in another direction, and it's now now they're doing a spooky song. It's a bit heavier, but it's more that it's using all kinds of disorganized sounds and melodies and stuff to like freak you out. So that's like three different cases of basically being like, oh, this is a scary horror rock song, right? You can find all three of those in different places on Tensho Rine. That hasn't happened yet, up until this album, I don't think. They've just been traveling at light speed through experimentation land, I suppose. Like, so this is an album where they're able to kind of mix and match and kind of mature their sound and everything they've got. Actually, what I'll say is, on Hiaki Yako, you started to feel that they were reaching back to past sounds, like heavier sounds, because it's a heavier album than the one that came before it. But it just sounds like complete. It just doesn't sound like anything they've ever made. Is the thing. So it's like it was. They were starting to reach back a little bit, but it's really in this album, Tensho Rine, that they're really trying to. It seems like they really thought about each song from an album perspective. I intentionally listened to it blind to not remind myself of which ones were PV tracks. There were a couple that I knew were PV tracks because I was like, they had already gotten stuck in my head. But I would say, which one's the one that is the... let's see. I'm looking for one in particular. Sorry, I don't have the names on every single one memorized yet. Oh, it would just be the title track. So like Tensho Rine, um, like that definitely throws back to Shuka Ensen in terms of like the level of of intensity and creepiness, but then at the same time it's trying. It also uh, has parts where it's almost like melodic and spooky, which is something I would point more towards uh, Kyoka Suigetsu. And then it tries like one new thing, like in this case, it's like the guitarist is screaming in the chorus, like that's the like one new thing. Like I hadn't seen Kiryu do that, um, as opposed to Hyaki Yako, which was like, they did so much with that. Um, but at the end there, they're focusing on making a solid Kiryu song for that. So yeah, like that's a song is growing on me over has had grown on me over time. Uh, there's another song that they put out a live PV for that comes right before it on the album called Hansu, and that got right into my head from day one. It's just like it's like a combination of like the most unexpected things, which is something you would see from like Hyaki Yako. But then it's like, but the unexpected things are all like these like quirky, spooky things. So it's like a quirky, catchy, spooky, indie sounding song. It sounds really indie for an indie band this big. That I think a lot of people look at Kiryu like, oh, they're not an indie band. It's like, because they're on BP. It's like, well, it's three of them, and that's it. Like, uh, um, it, it that so that song is it's really good. It's an earworm for sure. Like it gets way stuck in your head. But really, I I could probably talk about every song track by track. I won't. But what surprised me is that at least in the context of the album, I didn't. I enjoyed like all of the PV tracks. Like I guess they made more sense in that case. So I'm guessing like I was expecting more Hyaki Yako, and I got these singles I didn't know was turning into Tensho Rine, but because it sounded familiar to stuff before Hyaki Yako, I was like, uh-oh. So once again, Kiryu has somehow figured out a new and innovative way to subvert my expectations and pull a fast one on me. Yeah, so I'll give a couple other examples that aren't that aren't PV tracks, since I guess I'm like kind of shocked at like how well they worked in the context of the album. But so there's a track called Basada, and it is track number 8, and that one sounds like if Kiryu did a cover of like, oh man, what would even the band be? Like some kind of 90s like classic J-rock band. Like some actual 90s rock. Like it's just got like these badass like punk guitar riffs and stuff, and it's like I never would have expected them to do something like that, but they make it they make it work for them. Like they have like the the traditional instruments playing. It's like a flute, and and the punk guitar riffs, they slightly distort, or they slightly like switch up the rhythm from what you normally expect, so it's like a more frantic kind of song, which is like Kiryu plays these very frantic rhythms when they're playing more of their horror stuff. They want you to panic basically when you listen to their music. So I guess, and another one that comes right after it actually. Nope. How would you say this? Noporabo? No. Wait a minute. That can't be. No. Okay. Apparently, Noporabo. Is so track 9 basically is the vocalist is almost doing like a growl scream rap, like a western metal band, like a western like alt metal or industrial metal band. Where he's talking like this and he's kind of rapping poetry. He actually does that, and then he does like some deep screams, and but then it explodes into like this crazy melodic chorus, and like the traditional Japanese music is like like all these instruments are playing on top of each other, and it's like it's shocking and stunning, but it's like it's familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. So I don't know. They got me again. They caught me off guard again, and I just didn't expect the way they were gonna catch me this time, I guess. Because they caught, at the end of the day, they caught me off guard in that they successfully pitched to me the idea that you can go from being successful, from being wildly experimental, you can still go back and succeed by revisiting your past sounds, or other sounds from similar bands. Like if you want to take there's other influences on here, I think, that they do sound familiar, just not from Kiryu, if I remember correctly. Definitely this No Parable song, like it, there's some influence. And then some of it just sounds like a Kiryu from a long time ago, like Hansu, like I said. So I'm gonna be listening to this for like quite a while, but it's very good. And like I said, as a whole, and I see Lauren in chat said that the album is a really solid listen. I would agree with that. I think it's arguably, as an album, it's arguably the most enjoyable to listen to. I have no earthly idea how you would rank Kiryu albums, to be quite frank. At this point, I would have had an answer for you maybe 4 years ago, but not anymore. Not anymore. It seems like ever since, it seems like with each album, their approach to it continues to change and evolve as well, like what their priorities are. So there's not like with a lot of bands, you can kind of like see a discernible pattern of like growth, like either they have improved steadily in one direction, or they've like their style has shifted gradually in one direction, or some kind of characteristic that's kind of like, oh, this is like a trend that they've picked up because it's like their thing, and they're like, that's kind of a core thing that they continue to modify. But in Kiryu's case, it's like the priorities are what's like constantly evolving and shifting. So each album recently seems to have had a different priority, which is interesting. And yeah, I'll think about that concept more probably too. So I'll listen to the album, a bit more, and maybe do a follow-up stream. I feel like I'm ranking releases for Kiryu at some point. It has to be, it has to happen, because I know I just said I don't know how you would. I think I just said I don't know how you would rank releases, and then I proceeded to hypothetically map out a reason, and now I'm like, okay, I guess we can rank releases. Oh goodness. All right. Well, I very much enjoyed the album. I was listening to it in between prepping streams, just keeping me awake and engaged and everything. So, I would say definitely go check it out. Definitely check Kiryu out. Definitely check VKH Press out. At vkh-press.com. Lauren says I love ranking, so I am all for that. All right, yeah, sounds good. Yeah, I'm actually off to go get our surveys set up for this Saturday's ranking releases. I'll try and get those out ASAP. But we have four different ranking releases, surveys, and streams coming up. So we'll get in plenty of practice, and then we'll do Kiryu at some point in the future. So with all that being said, thank you very much for watching VKH Live. There may be an after hours tonight. It sort of depends on a few things, but it would be later on, and there's just a few things I want to test. The stream format seems to be working okay, but I would still like to figure out exactly what was going wrong. I have a few things I suspect, but the reality of the situation with these lives is that anything short of actually going live and streaming like you're trying to actually seriously stream ends up being like a cheap imitation that doesn't account for everything. Like for example, if I stream on someone else's channel versus mine, if I test my connection in the afternoon versus the evening. So but there's a couple things that I do want to try and break. I want to try and break the stream so I can identify what broke it last night. But yeah, so with all that, I will see you guys tomorrow. Peace out.